Hello everyone, it's Ali here with a brief introduction to this latest podcast, which is with the writer Donald S. Murray. In a moment you'll hear me talking to Donald at the Tolbooth in Stirling, who were very kind to host us. But I wanted to flag up a piece of music that we're going to play at the very end, so stay to the very end. In the podcast you'll hear Donald talking about Metagama and Atlantic Odyssey, which is a live show which was going to be at the Tolbooth that night. And he very kindly gave me a CD of the soundtrack and said we could play a track from it. So after you've heard Donald and I in conversation, you will hear a track from Metagama and Atlantic Odyssey. But for now, here's the podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Donald S. Murray to talk about his new novel, The Loch of the Bees, which is published with Saraband Books. Hello, Donald.
Hello, hi, how are you?
I'm really well, and we're here today in the Tolbooth in Stirling, which, you know, I'm not just saying that because we're here. It's one of my favourite venues and kind of arts hubs. But why are we here? What are you doing here tonight?
Well, I've got a fantastic event coming up. We have got this Metagama and Atlantic Odyssey concert going on, and we've had them all around the place. We've had them in Edinburgh, we've had them in Inverness, we've had them in Stornoway, all various venues, and we're having it in Stirling tonight. And it's about emigration. It's about Hebridean emigration to the States in 1923 and 1924, when 1,500 people left the Hebrides to go to Canada on 3 major vessels. So that had a huge effect, huge impact on the place, which already was, places like Lewis and Harris were already reeling because of the First World War, and the number of, percentage-wise, they lost more men than any other part of the British Isles. Right. And of course there was the Islair disaster at the end of it. So it had a huge psychological effect. And we are looking at the stories of some of the ones who made the emigration across to Canada and the United States, etc.
And it's a big musical piece, isn't it? You've got plenty of musicians involved.
It's a fantastic musical piece. I mean, I've got Lisa Mulholland, that's who I worked with initially. We went to Detroit, we went to Toronto, and we went to Chicago together to find out information. But I've also got the privilege of having Dalina McLennan, who was an Achievi at Stagan, many years ago. And then there's Willie Campbell, there's Charlie McCarran, there's John Joe McNeil. There's a wonderful young lassie too, who is just a terrific player. So we've got all these people. We've had a fantastic number of people in the show. So it's great. It's great. Juliet Lewisham.
As we speak, how many do you have left?
This is my last night.
It is, okay. But are there plans perhaps to do this in the future?
We'd certainly, I think we're contemplating that. This is the third tour we've been on. Yeah. And it's reaching a wider audience every time. It's had fantastic reviews. I mean, for instance, London Folk magazine and Welsh magazine both gave it 5 stars. Brilliant. Which must be a first time for an album with lots of Gaelic songs.
Yeah, because there is an album as well. People can get the CD.
Yes, they can CD. Yes, that's it. So there's all of that. And it's great. It's been great working with that.
Now, people who are familiar with your written work, where you're writing, know that you often look to history for inspiration for a lot of your novels, and that's definitely the case with The Loch of the Bees. Yes. Can you give us a brief description of the book?
Well, that's the most. It's in some ways it's the most complex book I've written.
You said before we started it's the most difficult one to
talk about because it starts off in the 8th century, and now where I grew up was a small village called South Dell in Ness in the Isle of Lewis, and we used to love. There was actually, you could go down to one shoreline which had a beautiful beach, but I much preferred going past the loch, the Loch Gibadal, because you could see. I mean, nowadays the other day I counted 35 swans on this really narrow thing, and then you'd go down to the shoreline, and you'd see the relics of old buildings lying there. It was fantastic. I loved it as a child, and you could almost imagine battles being fought there, and there had, of course, been swords found there. So that was a source of my inspiration, was that loch. But I've taken it all the way from the 8th century to the 21st century through that, and I've also invented things that weren't in Loch Gibetal. Shilling, or a nari, what we used to call a nari, or a beehive shilling. I created that on the loch, on a small island, by a priest, built by a priest.
And when I first started reading it, I thought this almost works as a book of short stories, because they're individual stories set out over time, but the place remains the same.
The place remains the same, and I think that's. I read one or two. I think it was the book called Cuddy. I remember reading and thinking, that's what I was planning to write 20 years ago. And, I have proof of that, because there's, just about everything I wrote about. First of all, my plan was to feature a road accident, a car accident on the loch. And a young person drowning. But I threw that out eventually, because I had a chat with someone who shares my own surname, another Mr. Murray, who told me how he had found bowls. He had dived into a Loch Langavat in Lewis, and he had come out clutching all these bowls that had been there centuries before.
Wow.
Amazing, what he had found. So I thought that was an inspiration to me.
Because there are discoveries. Almost, it made me think of the lady in the lake holding up the sword. Throughout, discoveries are made and artefacts are found, but it feels that it's the loch offering them up. It's the right time for these things to be found.
It's the right time, and that's what I was thinking. As I say, the Loch Gibetal, where I came from, there had been swords found there. There had been a battle there. So that the battle in the 8th century is, it's based on truth. It's based on truth. So, a conflict had been found there, and they had found the swords afterwards. And I think they're in the museum in Edinburgh. You see the swords there, so it's nothing.
And can you talk a little bit more about this structure that how did you approach the novel? Did you know you were going to jump to these specific, because although they're specific points in time, they're quite wide, as you say, 8th century, 21st century, I think 14th and 15th century in the middle.
Yes, but there were stories that I got from my own home community. I always remember as a child being told by somebody who had been pinched by the Royal Navy to go and fight in the Napoleonic Wars. And that was not unique. That actually happened in Shetland. I think about 75 men were pinched in Shetland.
Right, okay.
To go on that conflict. And I thought, that was the next village to me, and based on a true story. Apparently, the guy who had been stolen from the village of North Dell, next to me, he had returned 20 years afterwards in order to find out if the woman that he loved was still available. Yeah. And so that story was true. He came on a horse, but I removed the horse. I made him walk it, and I made him go to the shilling. Afterwards. So that was true. That was a true story.
And it's such a beautiful story. In fact, so many of these stories, I thought, these could be novels in their own right. The stories are so kind of rich.
Yeah, I think that one in particular, I thought when I was writing it, I thought you could do an awful lot if you went out and you did research into the Napoleonic Wars and the conflict that went on and the number of men who were pinched. It's amazing you even find it in Shetland, even in place names. There's some of the place names that are relevant to the district. There's a place name called Purgatory, which was apparently by a man who had been stolen by and he said, "Oh, I've been to hell," and he says, "I'm returning to Purgatory." Now, oddly enough, where I come from, where I live in Shetland, is a village called Cashel, and they reckon that was the French for prison cell.
All right.
After that.
Incredible. And were these well known before you wrote the book, or was that part of?
But I think, locals would know these. Even locals in Ness, would know about the man who had been stolen to there. But I know, for instance, I know stories about priests who somehow or other managed to be taken away to Solskith in the far north. By gannets, and laid there, their bodies lying there.
Did you say by gannets?
By gannets,
right.
Yes. Well, I think it was gannets, if I remember. That's where gannets nest nowadays. But huge birds taking them. That was the mythology.
Yes.
Clearly, that was not true.
No. I know. I was a bit open-jawed there, but I just thought the imagery of that is quite incredible.
It is, but that was one of the mythological stories I remember. People being taken. And again, I had family connections which I wasn't so aware of with the island of North Rona, where an awful lot of Ness people went at one time.
Before we talk about some of the people in the stories, can you tell us a bit more about the place? You've said that you had kind of childhood links to it, but is it all... could you go and visit the place and go to the places mentioned, or is there some fiction?
Oh, there's a lot of fiction.
Right.
Yes, a lot of fiction.
About the place itself?
About the place itself, because when I was writing about the loch, I started off writing about a very small loch.
Yes.
That was about 20 years ago when which it is. It's not a big loch. It's not a huge loch, the one that was there. But I also stretched it out, and not just in terms of factual, but also in terms of size. So I stretched it out, and I put a man-made island. But I didn't actually say in the book that it was really a man-made island, but that was not uncommon that people would go to these, small island that they had created in order to protect themselves from any. So that was for
reasons of safety and attack.
For safety of attack, but he built a shieling on it, and. A beehive shieling. Ari isn't the Gaelic word, but that if you travel around the Western Isles, you will find an awful lot of lochs with artificial islands, and Shetland too, where you can walk out to. Apparently, if you go through the stones, if you go underneath, if you know where the stone path is, you can walk out to, and that's where people went. At times of protection, when they were aware there was, violent acts, or even, in terms of hiding away, when they were being conscripted, they would go to places like that. So it's fast. I find that fascinating.
No, absolutely. And there's lots of secrets that come from the land, but also from the people. I mean, the land's kind of a character in its own right, I think. Constantly changing with the people who interact with it. You've mentioned a couple of the stories and where they came from, but let's go through a few more. As you see, you begin in the 8th century with a priest who's kind of there and is trying to keep his own secrets, I guess, is the way to say it. Where did that come from?
Well, it was something I was aware of, that, it was quite a difficult... I'd read somewhere, there is a fantastic book that I read, which I thought was very, very... and just give me 10 seconds. It was Towards a History of Irish Spirituality.
Okay.
and it was by a guy, Peter O'Dwyer O'Carm, and I encountered that quite by mistake. In a way, I picked it up and I thought, wow, that's a book I want.
Yeah.
And I borrowed an awful lot of the old prayers that Irish priests had said, because, of course, we would have shared the same language at that time. At that point in history. And also, most of our priests came from Ireland.
Yeah.
You have priests going up to Iceland. You have priests. One of the things I found absolutely fascinating is that if you go to the Faroe Islands, they use the same word for shillings as the Gaelic speakers do. And the same word for bull, and some of the place names are more linked to Gaelic than they are to Nordic.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because you wouldn't. And again, it was the priests going up there to these areas that gave the place names to the place names and some of the language to the Faroese. And
you have mentioned Nordic. We have the Viking influence as well, and I think that's where the sword comes in.
The sword comes in, yes. Battles come in. But I left that vague. I quite deliberately left that vague. I did think about it as kind of Nordic. Most people most Gaelic speakers where I come from, ironically, have a Nordic background. MacLeod, Macaulay, or the son of Olaf, if you go far enough back, and most of them are of Nordic background, not Celtic background. They just adopted the Gaelic language because it made sense to do that. My area, Ness, at the very top of Isle of Lewis, was probably the last one to adopt Gaelic. Yeah. So you get a lot of words that are actually linked to Nordic rather than to Nordic language rather than Gaelic.
And we see you've gone kind of through history, but you bring it right up to the present day.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit of the stories in the present day.
Well, the present day, for instance, I pinched a story. The wind. It's amazing how I can't remember the word I'm looking for just now. But I pinched that from a paper. The story of when they created a wind tower, or a wind farm. I've heard people call it wind towers as well. I actually prefer the word wind tower to wind farm.
Yeah.
And when they built it, it contaminated the waters nearby, and so I used that as a part of my story too, and that enabled me, in a sense, to bring it up to the 21st century, but also, how shall I put it? It also enabled me to. It was as a result of diving into the waters at that time. That's what enabled me to bring everything together at the end.
Yeah, because as I think I said, the place is the constant.
Yes.
And you've got the influence of it on the people, but also the influence of the people on it as well as it goes through.
For instance, the Highland clearances, a lot of them would have tried to hide in shillings and various locations to evade the whole shifting. That happened all the time. That happened in various points in our history. So that was another aspect of it. So, for dramatic reasons, they probably went to the shilling more than they would have done in normal circumstances. They did that in order to evade eviction.
Did the writing of the novel involve a lot of research?
Yeah, a lot of research over the years. Some of the books I'd read were years and years before, and some of them, were fairly recent, like that Irish book, which I thought was tremendous. I thought it was one of the best books I'd ever read. I think I read that about 6 times, that book. But there were other books that I'd read over the years about that, sometimes just articles about the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, that stayed in my head. And sometimes you can actually be more truthful, if you're loose, if you allow your imagination to remember the basic facts.
Just the
the basic,
the kernel of it.
Yeah, the kernel of it. You can add other things onto it.
Something I did want to ask you about was how, you're saying this novel's written over quite a period of time, going back as much as 20 years, did you say?
Yeah.
So how do you keep it fresh when you come to write it to be published?
Well, I think there was only, the battle at the start, I wrote that about 20 years ago.
Okay.
And I've got a piece where there's a car involved, going off the road.
Yeah.
And that was written about 20 years ago, that wee section. I just added that in. So you keep it fresh in the sense, for instance, there's 2 books of mine that took an extraordinary amount of time, but the Islair story, As a Woman Lay Dreaming, I started thinking about that about 20, 30 years ago. And I kept going, thinking about it, and then thinking, I've got that wrong. Go, try again.
Right.
And that was true of this book too. It comes from the same period in a way that you're kind of thinking back, and you think, I've got to change that. I've got to change that. And so these are my 2 long books. In terms of time, these are my 2 long books. That's
interesting, because I think it could be argued they're 2 of your best books as well.
Yes, I know that. I'm aware of that.
And I guess I wonder if the stories or the story stays with you over that period of time. You think, this is worth really working on because it's not left me.
I think sometimes it's a very good idea not to let it stay with you all that time. To go back to it later.
Right.
I've got another one in my head that's been there for years, and I'm going to be starting work on that one. I've already started. I had already got wee bits about it, but it's now that's what my next one is. Is going to be if everything works out.
Were there time periods in this book and stories maybe that you left out?
Oh yes, there would undoubtedly be. I didn't want to write very much about the First World War.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to write much about the Second World War because, as I say, I found talking after the As a Woman Lay Dreaming, at various venues. Some of it was rich and rewarding. But when just after I'd written the book, people would ask you questions that were, they would ask me, how, if you were living in Loch Of The Bees, how would you deal with a disaster there? If you were, I had questions there. Northern Ireland, how would you cope with what's there? I thought, I can't answer that. I have no idea how to answer that. I know that how they coped with a disaster like that in Lewis, they didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
As I said, the biggest war memorial in Scotland is actually just outside Stornoway. But that's because of the number of men that were killed at that time. So there's this huge, and there's names omitted from it. Someone was discussing that, but they kept the Islair, memorial was kept small,
right,
at a distance.
Yeah,
because they didn't want to think about it.
Yes, which is you can see that.
Oh, you can see that, and there were people I knew that in my own village, who I remember having a next door neighbour, and. He was living in what they call the Black House, the thatched cottage outside our home. And when I was a child, he used to terrify me because I'd hear him going down the road with waving a walking stick in his hand and shouting at the top of his voice.
Right.
Quite often in the morning. And I used to think, what on earth? He's swearing, and I thought, and I put my hands on my ears as if he was going to contaminate my hearing, but it wasn't. He was praying, apparently. He had lost 3 of his brothers in the war. He himself had been on 2 ships that had gone down. There was a sister across the road who apparently had a scarf on all times, so she wouldn't be able to see anyone. She didn't want to speak to anybody. So I was aware of that.
Yeah. So, in terms of,
effect.
to digress to that novel,
yes,
you were writing about it because you are from that place.
Yes.
I think it's kind of unfair to say how would you write about Loch of the Bees on
I
the
know.
Troubles. But a couple of things. One, they've had documentaries last year, Loch of the Bees,
I saw
films,
that, yeah.
novels written about them, whereas I had only heard once before about the Yalari.
The Iolair, that was, and even then it was shortened, Ian Crichton Smith.
Yes.
And even then, Ian Crichton Smith was actually criticised for writing about it within the undoubtedly I was too.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a healthy thing.
Yes.
Not talking about issues.
Yeah.
I've heard people argue even to the present day that you shouldn't talk about the Iolair disaster, you should just ignore it. And I'm thinking, I'm not convinced of that at all. I think the only way to deal with trauma is for people to be open about it.
Yeah. What I enjoyed actually, and it might not have been deliberate, but you said you didn't write about the Second World War or the First World War. But actually, for someone who's gaps in their Scottish history, I was taught Second World War and First World War, from the kind of British viewpoint. But there's so much in this Scottish history that I just didn't know about. And to fill in those gaps is fantastic.
Well, that's, I think, I think we didn't talk about these things, for possibly political reasons for a long, long time. And even, in a sense, the eradication of the Gaelic language, I think, has a lot to do with the First World War, particularly because the number of, people from Gaelic communities, were wiped out.
Yeah.
Men and again women left, and in a way, that's that certainly didn't help the survival of the tongue for many years. And it's very interesting that it's beginning to be, you feel as if it's beginning to be restored in a way it wasn't when I was in school. Because
you would think that the history of the Highlands and Islands in particular has been less told than other areas. Yeah. Do you think that is getting better?
I think it's getting better. I think there's still work to be done. I've also, by the way, the other thing I've done, even the last couple of days, I wrote a play called Secumar.
Okay.
I don't know if you know about that. That's now become a higher text in Scotland. And
you mentioned that to me last time we spoke.
Yes. But again, that was remember as a child. 12, 13-year-old, we went to this old building where we were taught Francis Street in Stornoway, and I remember sometimes when you used to misbehave, I probably did that quite a lot of the time, you were chucked out of the classroom, and I remember counting the names of all the ex-pupils in the school that had been killed, and there were 148.
God.
Of all, which given the size of population was a huge number. And it wasn't all, as I say, that was just the ex-pupils of that school, and that was not the majority of kids in the islands. But, they had gone to war at an early stage, and it's just awful, actually, when you think about it. It's awful.
Absolutely. And actually there are a number of themes which are interlinked, a bit like the stories are interlinked that run throughout, and, death being one of them, but also religion, love, obsession. Were these things that you really wanted to explore, or did they come out from the stories?
Oh, they just came out from the stories. Yeah. I think they came out from the stories. I mean, in a sense, even the second last chapter, even though I underplayed that to a certain extent because it was about COVID and about that, but partly, it is again the loss of people. We in a curious way, we're going through another clearances in the Hebrides and various places, because the number of locals leaving home has become huge.
Right.
All the way from the butt of Lewis all the way down to Barra. But I decided I didn't want to overplay that. So I have one man being a spokesperson on that role, but I deliberately didn't want him to. I left him a kind of slightly unsympathetic person.
Yeah.
And that was a deliberate thing.
It's really interesting to read a COVID story in well, for me, remote place.
Yes,
you know, because there are different questions being asked
about it. Yeah, so that, but you know, as I say, it wasn't purely about COVID. It was also about the lack of population. Yeah, the population declining.
Now, you've mentioned in your quite a lengthy acknowledgements about some of the places that you've taken things from and inspirations. And throughout, there's some poetry, there's some journal articles and other different types of writing. Can you talk about their inclusion and how they affected the novel, the writing?
Well, the other thing is Gaelic songs were full of are full of songs about shillings and arries and lochs. And, I remember a lot of them. There was a group called the Lochies, who I remember, when I was young, playing one about the shillings, and there was another one, a young Flair, a group called the Flair, and then there's Runrig, and, a host of songs, Caper Cayley, huge number of songs about shillings and lochs, whereas in English, you're almost restricted to Loch Lomond, that Bonnie Banks. But even some of the ones that were translated into English actually were originally Gaelic. Sean Ma'ari, Elan below me Loch Marie, lead me to my solitude and let me wander free. So that was a song that's now sung in English.
Yes.
But it was a Gaelic song to begin with. So I found that inspirational, and I found I've always found the writing of Ian Crichton-Smith inspirational too.
And absolutely.
And particularly Ian Crichton-Smith, I found that absolutely wonderful. I remember him talking. He was very encouraging to me about becoming a writer.
Right.
And he said to me, he says, one of the worst things of coming from a small community, he says, I remember him saying to me, is that the one thing that people are going to say to you is, well, who the shin kjar? You got that wrong. And I feel that kind of strengthens you, in a way. You're kind of aware in a small community that's the state of mind.
Yeah.
And as I said, I could go to George Mackay Brown, who also, of course, the one thing they never mention about George Mackay Brown is that he came from a Gaelic-speaking background too. His mother was a Gaelic speaker. And I think, that bilingualism does blend you, give you a sense of the rhythms of language.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, particularly in a language that for a long time was suppressed.
Oh, yes, absolutely suppressed, yes, there's no doubt about that.
And you've mentioned shillings a few times. There's a couple of pages called Shillings in Gaelic Culture. Maybe just explain exactly what shillings are.
Well, shillings were, the Gaelic word is addy, as I think I said before. But the shillings were places that were regularly used, sometimes on the moor, for shelter. For people, for instance, working with sheep or looking, going on the moor, looking for sheep, if they were grazing there. So that would have been part of it. They would deliberately go to these places in order to gain shelter. But there were other ways in which people like to go there for isolation. For fishing too, of course, they would go there. So there's a whole lot of reasons for that.
Yeah.
And I dare say, there were the odd. I know there were the odd romances that took place in shillings too.
You've got a copy of the book there, and I was just wondering, is there any piece you'd like to read from it?
I don't know.
It's up to you.
I find it very at this stage in life.
Don't feel you need to.
As I say, I am aware that I'll read the ones. The other thing I deliberately chose was bees.
Yes, well, we haven't talked about the bees yet. So we haven't even explained really why it's the Loch of the Bees.
The Loch of the Bees, Loch na Shalla. But bees were regarded as sacred.
And rightly so,
Gaelic, and rightly so in Gaelic culture. So I wrote a number of ones about that, and it's amazing how I can't. Oh yes, here it is.
Okay.
Bees must resent being notorious for stings they occasionally inflict upon human head or hand. They bear so many shades along with them, bringing hues of orange, red and white, bands of yellow upon abdomens extending to the rear of chests. They carry colours with them, including a small sweep of black that humans fear, connecting this with pricks imposing venom on bare flesh. Such a limited interpretation that fails to perceive how all of life contains its share of perils, how danger sometimes stalks people when climbing mountains, hills, or stepping near the waters of a bog or loch.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. So, and has the title always been with you?
No, I think I threw the bees in at a later stage.
It's a lovely title. It's such an evocative title, The Loch of the Bees.
But, one of my favourite lochs that I've ever seen in my life is in South Uist.
Right.
And it's Loch Bee, it's called.
Oh, okay.
But that's a Gaelic. It actually is not Loch. It's got not. It's not connected to that. And I think people nowadays don't know the meaning of what it was. What it was, the Loch Bee. But that was in my head, and I remember going there, and the huge number of swans.
Right.
Absolutely amazing number.
Wow.
So I think it's the best loch I've ever seen in terms of the bird life there.
Yeah.
Just fascinating. I think I counted about 70 swans on this loch once. Amazing place. And
there's not just bees in the novel. Wildlife, nature. It's a very nature-filled read as well. You really, again, that goes back to the land, I think.
Yes, you go back to that, and I've always been aware of that. Mm-hmm. As a child, I was aware of it. You could see, all the various, see and hear all the various birds around you. In a way, you don't notice in an urban place, an urban environment, half as much. Nowadays you see so many seagulls around the average supermarket, but
yes, that's right. The urban seagull is definitely become a thing.
But just the range of birds.
And it's become a bit of a cliche. But do you think that historical novels always have something to say to the present day?
I think they do. I think they all do. I think it's about the only thing we can learn lessons from. People are looking for easy solutions for all life's torments and trials, and but I think if we learn, it seems to me that when I look at global politics, since a certain man with Lewis connections has taken over the United States, I'm thinking we're going back to the 1930s again.
Yeah.
And the political, even politically here, everywhere, there's there's a certain political party, the Reforms, who seem to me to be a recurrence of what happened.
Not learning lessons from the past, or even refusing to learn lessons.
Refusing to learn lessons, so it's appalling, actually.
And what's interesting about all the stories that run through the Loch of the Bees is it kind of shows you that there's more that unites us than divides us, because there are these themes of love and life and grief and big themes that kind of carried through it.
Yeah, and there's other things, the eradication of the Gaelic language.
Yes,
I used
Highland clearances.
The Highland clearances, and also the Highland. I used it, which I know, happened in my father's lifetime. They did get the belt if they were heard speaking Gaelic in public. I think my grandfather's day they used to put a wooden bolt over their necks.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, but even and that had an effect. And as I say, I'm conscious that there has been a revival of Gaelic, perhaps not absolute, but it's those who have Gaelic at least value it now, where there was a time when they wanted to forget about it. I always remember a man from the village saying, "Oh, Highness, how come Gaelic? How come? I don't know why I've got Gaelic." And he said, "It's a waste of time." I remember
that's an alternative viewpoint.
That's an alternative viewpoint. Yes, yeah, I remember that.
I was wondering how you reflect on a novel once it's published. Even if you do, you may not. But is it different every time, or do you easily move on to the next?
Well, I found this the most difficult novel to move on from. I found, as I say, 3 months. I was 2.5 months. I found it difficult to do any work.
Yeah,
any creative work.
Sure.
Whereas all the other books, you kind of, within about a month, I found myself starting something again. Whereas this one, I found it just slightly more difficult. And I think that's because I was drawing on things that had gone back for all that length of time. And also not being unsure that it was, good enough,
Right. And that's always a fear, I guess.
It is a fear, anything. I think we all fear that. And plus, I suppose the other thing is, I'm going to Canada shortly. I'm going to New Zealand in a while, and that's also been coming up in my thoughts. I mean, if you had told me a few years ago that I would be, going to New Zealand for 2 months to do some work down there, I would have thought you were completely mad.
Yeah.
And again, Canada. Well, as I say, once this music tour is over, I'm going home for a week, and then I'm going to Canada for 3 weeks, and that's where I'm starting the foundation for my new novel.
The reason I asked that question is because I think your novels stay with me as a reader for long after I've shut the final page, and particularly as The Women Lay Dreaming, which I recommend to many people, and this one as well, The Loch of the Bees. I finished it about 3-4 weeks ago. And these stories kind of keep coming in, and I get part of it is because it is stories I had never heard before. Yes,
yeah. But a lot of them are based upon the truth. An awful. That's what people happened. For instance, one of the places I was in Canada for the last time was a place called Ripley, Ontario, and that was full of not so much nowadays, but most of them came from the villages that were right beside me. Growing up in Lewis, all the local villages. So that had a huge effect on me too. And I wrote that. I used the Ripley, Ontario, as part of the inspiration for one of the stories.
Are there specific challenges in writing real events and places as fiction?
I think there's much more challenges in writing about them in non-fiction.
That's interesting, because you have to.
You have to be very exact. You have to be very exact.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're writing in fiction, you've got a wee bit of freedom about it.
So, Donald, what are you up to next? You've mentioned a few things. We're in the theatre where you're going to be. It's going on tonight. And you mentioned you're off to New Zealand and Canada as well. Have you managed to fit anything else in?
Well, at the moment, no. I haven't managed to fit anything else in.
Quite right.
The musical event is wonderful. It's also exhausting.
Yeah.
You sleep in a different bedroom every night, so you find it hard to relax in that location. No, it's been very, as I say, there's been an awful lot, and I'm really chuffed. I'm really delighted with the second one. I spoke to about 90 pupils in Kirkcaldy that first time about the play, because they've been studying the play, and I had 70 pupils in Loch Of The High School in Fort William yesterday, talking to them about the play, and I know that an awful lot of pupils will get something out of it, because partly it's about school.
Yeah.
It's about school life. It's
also,
about education.
It's so important. You know, I was when I was at school, I was lucky enough to have a teacher who really pushed Scottish literature and Scottish writing, and you know, it's where I found Sunset Song.
Yes.
You know, for the first time.
I had exactly the same.
And then we did the Chivy at the Stag and the Black Oil, and here was a whole history of Scotland I didn't know anything about. So it really kind of sparked. You know, partly sparked my interest in all these things. And
I think I almost had a duplicate existence to you because, you know, again, I was very lucky in some of the teachers I had. You know, I had Sunset Song, but we also, we had a production of the Chivy, the Stag and the Black Oil in the school.
Oh, wow.
So I remember being about 14 and seeing people like Delina McLennan, who I'm now working with, 14, 15 at the time, and that opened up. I remember thinking, and I think I was the first to stand and applaud of all the youngsters, and then the others began to stand too.
It's funny the twists that life takes, isn't it?
Yes.
Actually, that same teacher, since we're in Stirling, I'll tell the story, took 3 of us, I think, to Stirling University to see and hear Callum McDougall, the late Callum McDougall, read. And that was another moment that I'll just never forget. And years later, I was lucky enough, because I was chairing an event at the university, to be able to tell him just what that meant.
Yes, I know, it's fantastic. And, you know, I used to take pupils from astronomy to various plays, you know, around the place, you know, both Shakespeare, Arthur Miller, and the other one I loved, Brian Friel.
Yeah.
I absolutely, if you're going to ask me who my favourite playwright was, Brian Friel would be my answer, and particularly translations, because I could identify with it.
Yeah.
I could identify with the material behind it.
Donald, it's always such a pleasure to be able to catch up and talk to you. All the very best with not just the Loch of the Bees, but everything else that you're doing.
Thank you very much. That's lovely.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. And thanks again to Donald for taking the time to talk to me, and to everyone at the Tolbooth in Stirling for being such generous hosts. And as promised at the very start of this podcast, this is a track from the album Metagama, an Atlantic Odyssey, which is the soundtrack to the play and musical that Donald was speaking about. This track's called Would You Write Me a Letter?
It's a fine country this, make no mistake. But at night in my bed I'm lying awake, remembering songs by the peat fire flame, the laughter and love from whence I came. Would you write me a letter and tell me of home? It's all I can think of as I ramble and roam. Tell me of the wildflower, the wave on the shore, and the call of the curlew, for my heart it is sore. Went to the plains and some to the lakes. Some went out west and some to the States. Down to Chicago, New York and Detroit. I think I'll go join them, cross over tonight. heart it is so.